The phone rang at 11:58 on Christmas night. I know the exact time because I was still awake, sitting in my truck in the driveway of my own house, engine off, watching snow collect on the windshield in slow, deliberate layers. I hadn't been able to go inside yet. Couldn't face the quiet of the living room, the single place set at the table that I hadn't used, the tree with its lights blinking at no one. I was just sitting there in the cold, still in my coat, still holding the keys in my hand like I might need them again. The screen lit up. My daughter-in-law's name. I stared at it for 2 full rings. I pressed the green button and put the phone to my ear, and before I could say a single word, I heard her crying. Not polite crying, not the kind of thing you can compose yourself out of in 30 seconds. The deep, shaking, barely able to breathe kind. The kind that only happens when something has been held back for a very long time and suddenly the dam gives all at once. Frank. Her voice barely came through. Frank, please come back. My father, he isn't who we thought he was. He isn't who any of us thought he was. Please, Frank, please come. I didn't ask questions. I didn't say, "Are you sure?" Or, "What do you mean?" Or, "Let me think about it." I had spent 31 years as an executive protection driver for a private security firm, and in 31 years, you learn very quickly that there are 2 kinds of phone calls in this world. The kind where you have time to think, and the kind where you don't. This was the second kind. I recognized it the way you recognize a smell you haven't encountered in 20 years. Instantly, in your bones, before your mind even catches up. I turned the key in the ignition. The truck engine came to life and I pulled back out of that driveway, and I drove back toward my son's house in the falling snow, and I thought about how 3 hours earlier I had driven away from it with a kind of ache in my chest that I hadn't felt since the day my wife passed, and how strange it was that Christmas could break you open more than almost any other night of the year. But to understand any of that, you'd have to go back. Way back. Because nothing that happened on Christmas night came out of nowhere. It was the end of something that had been building for a very long time. And the beginning of something I hadn't seen coming, even though maybe I should have. My name is Frank Calloway. I'm 63 years old, and I live in a small house in Millhaven, Ohio, which is the kind of town where everybody knows your truck and half the people wave at it out of habit even when you're not inside. I spent 31 years driving for a private security and executive protection company out of Columbus. Professional drivers for high-value clients, politicians, corporate executives, the occasional celebrity passing through the state. I wasn't muscle. I was logistics. I was the calm in the car. I was the man who knew every alternate route into and out of every major city in Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky, who knew how to read a room from the parking lot before anyone walked inside it, who knew that the most dangerous thing you can do in a crisis is move fast before you've thought clearly. I retired 4 years ago, 3 years after my wife, Carol, died of pancreatic cancer at the age of 58. She was gone in 4 months from diagnosis to the last morning. That kind of loss doesn't leave you. It just changes shape over time, like a stone in a river. It gets smoother, but it's still there. It's always still there. I have one son. His name is Daniel. Danny, when he was small. He's 34 now, and he is, without any competition, the best thing I've ever been a part of. When Carol was dying, Daniel was 29, and he drove 4 hours every weekend from Columbus to Millhaven to sit with her, to hold her hand, to bring her the lemon sorbet she loved even when she couldn't eat much of anything else. He is a good man. He has always been a good man. And I want you to hold on to that, because what I'm about to tell you is not a story about a bad son. It is a story about a good son who got lost for a little while, who let someone get into his head, who made choices I didn't understand and said things that hurt me more than he probably knew. Because good people can be influenced. Good people can be told enough times that something is true that they start to believe it, even when it isn't. He met Melissa Hargrove 18 months before this past Christmas. He met her at a work event in Columbus, some industry reception for the engineering firm he works for. She was there with a colleague. They got to talking at the drinks table, and by the end of the night they had exchanged numbers. He called me the next morning, and I could hear it in his voice before he even said her name. That thing that happens when someone has just met a person who changes the air around them. He sounded lighter. He sounded awake in a way that he hadn't sounded in a while. "She's something else, Dad," he said. "She's really something else." I told him I was glad. I meant it. I met Melissa 6 weeks later, at a Sunday dinner at Daniel's apartment in Columbus. She was lovely, genuinely lovely. Warm smile, dark eyes, the kind of attentiveness that makes you feel like what you're saying actually matters to someone. She asked me about my career with real curiosity, not the polite nodding that sometimes passes for interest. She laughed at my dry jokes. She helped clear the dishes without being asked. When she left that evening, I put my arm around my son's shoulders and I said, "She's good, Danny. She's real good." And she was. I believe that. I believe Melissa was exactly what she appeared to be that night at Daniel's apartment. A warm, genuine, kind young woman who loved my son without any agenda. I want to be clear about that, because this story is not about Melissa. It never was. It was about her father. I want to say something to you, if you're watching this right now. If you have ever sat in a cold car on Christmas night and felt like you were on the outside of a life you built, I want you to know that I see you. I know what that silence sounds like. And I want you to stay with me until the end of this story. Because I promise you, it doesn't end in that driveway. It doesn't end in the cold. If this has already touched something in you, leave me a like. Leave me a comment and tell me if you've ever felt pushed out of a table you helped build. Subscribe to this channel, because these are real stories about real families, and every single one of them deserves to be heard. Now, let me tell you about Gerald Hargrove. 3 months before that Christmas, none of us could have predicted what Christmas night would look like. 3 months before it, the biggest problem in my relationship with Daniel and Melissa was a matter of scheduling. They'd gotten married in September, a beautiful ceremony in a venue outside Columbus, a converted barn with string lights and late summer flowers, and in the weeks after the wedding, everyone was still in the warm, buzzing aftermath of a new marriage. Melissa was adjusting to her new last name. Daniel was talking about buying a house. Life felt from the outside like it was moving in exactly the right direction. Gerald Hargrove came into my awareness slowly, the way weather does. You don't notice the pressure changing until the temperature drops. I first met him properly at the engagement party back in April. He arrived in a car I recognized, a late-model Mercedes S-Class, silver, the kind of vehicle you choose when you want people to know you're not struggling. He was a tall man, early 60s, thick silver hair kept very well, the kind of posture that announces itself in a room. He sold commercial real estate out of Cincinnati, or so Daniel had told me. Successful, Daniel said. Very successful. He shook my hand the way some men do when they're measuring you. A fraction too firm, a fraction too long, eye contact that's more assessment than greeting. Frank, he said, like he already knew me well enough to use my name with that particular casual ownership. I've heard a great deal about you. Same, I said. Daniel thinks very highly of Melissa. That says a lot about where she comes from. He smiled. It was a wide smile, and it didn't quite reach his eyes, and I noticed that. And then I told myself I was being unfair. I told myself I was doing what protective people do when someone enters their child's life. I was looking for threats. I was running threat assessment on a man whose only crime so far was a slightly firm handshake and eyes that were careful. I told myself to stop it. I told myself Carol would have told me the same thing. So I set it aside. And for a while, I managed to keep it set aside. But there are things you can't entirely stop noticing when your whole career was built on noticing them. The first incident that I couldn't quite file away happened at Thanksgiving, 6 weeks before Christmas. Daniel and Melissa were hosting for the first time as a married couple, which was a big deal to them. They'd spent a month planning the menu, reorganizing their dining room, buying new serving dishes. I drove down from Millhaven the night before to help Daniel with whatever he needed, which turned out to be assembling a new leaf for the dining room table and carrying boxes from the storage unit across town. We worked until almost midnight, and it was good. It was the kind of easy, tired, companionable silence that fathers and sons fall into when they're building something together. And I went to bed in their guest room feeling, for the first time in a long while, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Gerald and his wife, Patricia, arrived at noon the next day. Gerald walked in as though he were walking into a meeting he'd convened. A quick survey of the room, a brief approving nod at the table, a comment about the parking situation outside that somehow managed to sound like a criticism, even though the words weren't technically critical. He took his coat off and handed it to Melissa without looking at her, and she took it without comment, and Daniel didn't notice, and I noticed all of it, but I said nothing. Dinner was fine. It was genuinely fine for most of it. Good food, light conversation, the particular warmth of a table full of people who are still learning each other. And then Gerald said something that has stayed with me since. Daniel had been telling a story about a project at work. Some structural engineering problem he'd solved with a creative approach that had impressed his team. He was telling it well, with the modest pride of someone who doesn't usually brag about their achievements. Halfway through the story, Gerald put down his fork and said, with a smile that managed to be both charming and somehow dismissive, "That's the thing about public sector adjacent work, Daniel. It teaches you to be creative with limited budgets because the ceilings are so low." The table went quiet for a half-second. Daniel's smile stayed on his face, but his eyes shifted just slightly. The story ended differently than it had started. He wrapped it up in 2 sentences, and then asked Gerald about his own work, and the conversation moved on. But I watched Melissa in that moment. I watched her hands on the table, very still, and the way she looked briefly at her plate before looking back up and smiling, and I thought, this is not the first time she's watched her father do that to someone. I thought about bringing it up with Daniel later, when we were cleaning up in the kitchen. I had it on the tip of my tongue. But then I thought about what Daniel would say, that I was being oversensitive, that Gerald was just an opinionated man, that not everyone communicated the same way. And I thought about the fact that he was building a life with Melissa, and that Melissa loved her father, and that the last thing a new marriage needs is its older generation making everything into a conflict. So I rinsed the dishes, and I kept my mouth shut. I kept my mouth shut the way I had kept it shut the next time and the time after that. The pattern didn't announce itself. It never does. It built the way rust builds, quietly, persistently, underneath the surface, and by the time you see it, it's already been there a long time. At a dinner in early December, Gerald made a remark about my truck. I drove a 2019 Ford F-150 dark blue, which I kept clean and in excellent mechanical condition. Not a new truck, but not a neglected one. Gerald looked at it in Daniel's driveway and said, "Still getting good mileage on that thing, Frank?" In the tone of a man asking a homeless person if their cardboard box was keeping them dry. I said, "She runs perfectly. I prefer reliability over novelty." Gerald smiled. "Of course you do." I let it go. I put it on the mental shelf with the other things I'd filed away. But there are some shelves that can only hold so much. 2 weekends before Christmas, Melissa and Daniel came up to Millhaven to help me sort through some of Carol's things I'd finally decided to donate. 4 years later, still a hard undertaking. And I'd asked for Daniel's help not because I couldn't do it physically, but because I didn't want to do it alone. We spent the morning going through boxes, and it was the kind of morning that's full of small, sudden griefs. A scarf that still smelled faintly of her perfume, a birthday card she'd saved from 1987, photographs of Daniel as an infant that made him go very quiet and hold each one for a long moment. At one point, Melissa went to make coffee, and Daniel and I were alone in the bedroom. And I looked at my son in the winter light from the window, and I saw something on his face I'd never quite seen there before. A tiredness that was different from being overworked. A flatness behind the eyes. "You doing okay?" I asked. "Just that." He nodded. "Yeah, fine. Not asking about work, asking about you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Gerald thinks I should push for a management position at the firm. Says I'm wasting my time in the technical track." I kept my voice level. "What do you think?" "I think I like what I do." He paused. "I think I'm good at it." "You are good at it," I said. "You've always been good at it." He looked at me, and for a second he was 14 again, looking for the confirmation that the thing he'd built was actually as solid as he thought it was. I wanted to say more. I wanted to say, "And you don't need Gerald Hargrove to tell you what kind of engineer you should be." But I didn't say that either, because Daniel hadn't asked me to, and I have learned, slowly and with difficulty, that my son is a grown man, and he has to navigate his own life, and my job is to be the wall he can lean against, not the voice that tells him which direction to walk. But I was watching, and I was getting worried in a quiet, steady way that didn't go anywhere. Then came Christmas. Daniel called me the second week of December to plan. They were hosting again, their first Christmas as a married couple, and he wanted me there. He told me who else was coming: Melissa's mother, Patricia, and Gerald. He told me the meal plan, the time, the rough schedule. Normal conversation, easy and warm. And then near the end of the call, almost as an afterthought, he said it. "Oh, and Dad, Melissa wants Gerald to sit at the head of the table. I hope that's okay." I didn't say anything for a beat. She feels like, and I think it makes sense, he's the patriarch of the family now. We're all one family now. And he's older. He's established. He's more important now, I said. I wasn't being sarcastic. I was just finishing the sentence the way I heard it. There was a pause on Daniel's end. "That's not what It's all right," I said. And I meant it in that moment. Or I thought I meant it. "It's your house, Danny. You seat whoever you like, wherever you like." He thanked me. He sounded relieved. We said goodbye. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after that. I want to be very precise about what I felt. I didn't feel angry. Not then. What I felt was something more like a slow internal dimming, like a light turning down rather than going out. I had driven 4 hours round trip to help my son build the table that another man was going to sit at the head of on Christmas Day. And the man at the head of that table was a man who had, in every small and deliberate way over the previous 7 months, communicated to everyone around him that he was the most significant presence in any room he occupied. And my son had internalized that narrative. Not because he was weak, because he was trying. He was trying to build a family out of 2 different ones, and someone had convinced him that the way to do that was to subordinate one to the other. I drove down to Columbus on Christmas morning. I brought a pie, Carol's recipe, apple with a lattice crust that I'd learned to make badly, and then, over 4 years of practice, learned to make decently. I brought it in a dish with a red cloth over the top, and when Melissa opened the door, she hugged me warmly and said it smelled incredible, and I believed her. The morning was fine. It was genuinely fine, the way a thing can be fine on the surface while something underneath is not. Melissa's mother, Patricia, was there. Quiet and pleasant in a way I'd come to understand was her primary coping strategy for being in the same room as her husband. She helped in the kitchen. She complimented everything. She took up as little space as possible, physically and conversationally. I recognized the pattern. I had just never had a name for it yet. Gerald arrived at 11. He hadn't spent the night. He and Patricia were at a hotel, which should have been a detail too small to notice, except that Melissa had mentioned in passing that he preferred hotels to guest rooms because he liked to control his own environment. He arrived with a bottle of wine that he described as very hard to find outside of certain markets, and which he handed to Daniel with the gravity of someone bestowing an honor. He shook my hand, the firm grip, the measured eye contact. Same as always. "Frank," he said, "glad you could make it." As if this were his event, and I were the guest. I smiled and said I wouldn't have missed it for anything. Christmas dinner was at 2 o'clock. The table was beautiful. Melissa had spent real time on it, and it showed. White tablecloth, candles, the good china they'd gotten as a wedding gift. I had been at family holiday tables my whole life, and I know what love looks like when it's pressed into a table setting. That table was full of it. Gerald sat at the head. Daniel sat to his right. Melissa sat to his left. I was placed at the far end, between Patricia and a cousin of Melissa's who had joined at the last minute. It was a small distance geographically, but it didn't feel small. Gerald was charming through most of the meal. He talked about a real estate development he was overseeing in the Cincinnati market. He talked about a trip he and Patricia had planned for February. He asked Daniel once how the technical work was going, with just enough emphasis on the word technical to communicate what he thought of it. He told a long story about a business deal that placed him naturally as the decisive and brilliant center of events. He told it well. I'll give him that. He was a gifted storyteller, and the table laughed in the right places. And then, somewhere in the dessert portion of the afternoon, we'd gotten to the pie, which Gerald had accepted a slice of and declared, "Not bad." He turned to me with a particular kind of attention, the kind that is not a compliment but wants to look like one. "Frank," he said, "Daniel tells me you drove for some kind of company for 30 years? 31, I said. "A driver," he repeated, just the word, sitting there by itself. And did you find that fulfilling? As a career? The table got very slightly quieter. I did, I said. I worked with a lot of remarkable people, kept them safe. I take some pride in that. Of course, he said with a nod that somehow contained the phrase, "How modest of you." He picked up his fork again. It's important work. Every system needs its logistics people. I heard Patricia set her fork down very quietly. I heard Melissa take a small breath. I heard Daniel not say anything. I put my napkin on the table. I stood up. Gerald, I said, with complete calm. Melissa, Daniel, thank you for a beautiful Christmas. Dinner was exceptional. I'm going to head home. Daniel looked up at me, surprised. Dad, there's still cake. I'll call you tomorrow, I said. I kissed Melissa on the top of the head, nodded at Patricia, and I looked at Gerald for exactly 1 second. Not with anger, not with threat, just with the kind of steady, clear-eyed look that says, I see you exactly as you are, and what you are isn't frightening to me. And then I got my coat and I walked out. I drove back to Millhaven. It was snowing by then. I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine and sat there in the dark and the snow. And I thought about my wife. I thought about the Christmases we'd had around that same table in that same house, before the disease took her, before Daniel moved to Columbus, before everything rearranged itself the way lives always eventually do. I thought about how full those rooms had once been, and how quiet they were now. I thought about whether I had done the right thing by leaving. And then, at 11:58, the phone lit up on the seat beside me. I was back in Daniel's neighborhood by 12:20. I know the roads well enough that the snow didn't slow me much. The house was lit from the inside, every window bright, and I sat in the truck for 30 seconds looking at it and thinking about what I was walking back into. I knocked. Daniel opened the door. His face was complicated. Relief and something like shame and something like confusion, all braided together in a way he hadn't learned to untangle yet. He stepped back to let me in. The living room told the story before anyone said a word. Gerald was sitting in an armchair, not at the table anymore. His silver-haired composure slightly, not shattered. Men like Gerald don't shatter easily. But noticeably cracked. Patricia was on the sofa beside Melissa, one arm around her daughter, her face the face of a woman who had been waiting for a long time for something to break open, and was now watching it happen with a grief that was also, underneath, a kind of relief. Melissa stood up when she saw me. Her eyes were red and swollen. She crossed the room and held on to me for a moment, and I let her, and I looked over her shoulder at Daniel, who was still standing by the door with his hands in his pockets like he didn't quite know what to do with them. "Tell me," I said, gently, to the room. It came out in pieces the way these things always do. Melissa first, and then Patricia, and then, the part that surprised me, Gerald himself, who sat in that armchair and for the first time in all the months I'd known him, looked like a man without a script. The real estate business in Cincinnati was not what it had appeared to be. The deals, the developments, the bottle of wine from hard-to-find markets, all of it surfaced over something that had been hollowing out for years. Gerald Hargrove had spent the better part of a decade borrowing money against assets he didn't fully own, convincing investors of projects that were either exaggerated or outright fabricated, and building an image of wealth and power on a foundation that was, it turned out, almost entirely debt and performance. His partners had found out. His investors had found out. A federal investigation had been opened in November 2 months earlier, and Gerald had known about it since the first week of December, 3 weeks ago. He had come to Christmas dinner knowing. He had sat at the head of that table with his wine and his measured contempt for everyone else's ordinariness. Knowing. He had not told Patricia. He had not told Melissa. He had not told Daniel. Patricia had found out 2 hours before I came back. She'd found a letter in the pocket of Gerald's coat when she went to hang it up, a formal notification from an attorney. She'd read it twice, put it back, said nothing during dessert, and then, when Gerald stepped outside to take a phone call, she had handed it to Melissa without a word. Melissa had called me while Gerald was still on the porch. I sat down in a chair across from Gerald. The room was very quiet. The Christmas tree blinked its slow, patient lights in the corner. Outside, the snow was still coming down. "Gerald," I said, "how long have you known?" He looked at me, and for the first time, the assessment in his eyes was replaced by something else. Something raw and almost bewildered, like a man who had spent so long performing competence that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen without it. 3 weeks, he said. And you said nothing. I was still trying to... You were managing the narrative, I said. You wanted to control the information until you had a way to present it on your terms. He stared at me. I've spent 31 years reading rooms and reading people, I said. I've sat in parking lots and dining rooms and executive offices with men who were very good at projecting power and very good at controlling information, and I've learned, over those 31 years, that the ones who work hardest to control the story are the ones most afraid of what the actual story says about them. The room was so quiet I could hear the snow against the window. I'm not your enemy, I said. I'm not interested in watching you be humiliated, but these people in this room deserve the truth. All of it. Tonight. Gerald Hargrove, who had held the head of the table 6 hours ago and rendered judgment on my truck and my career with the casual authority of a man who has never once been questioned, looked in that moment like someone I almost felt sorry for. Almost. He started talking. It took a long time. It took most of the rest of the night. By the time the police arrived, and they arrived because there were aspects of what Gerald described that required immediate contact with the federal representatives already involved in the case, a call that Daniel's lawyer, who was on speed dial from an old professional connection, advised making promptly. It was almost 4 a.m. 2 agents came to the door. Professional, quiet, everything by procedure. They spoke to Gerald for a long time, and they spoke to the rest of us separately. And at one point, one of the agents, a woman in her late 40s named Agent Carver, came to sit with me in the kitchen while we waited for Gerald's formal interview to conclude. She looked at me with the measured interest of someone trying to figure out where a piece fits. You were executive protection for Premier Security Group out of Columbus, she said. It wasn't a question. 31 years, I said. She nodded slowly. I've worked with people from your firm before. Good outfit. She paused. You staying calm tonight? That helped. These situations can go in a lot of directions. I know, I said. You've seen worse. I've seen different, I said. This is the kind of crisis that hurts more than most. She looked at me, and she seemed to understand that I wasn't talking about the legal complexity of Gerald Hargrove's fraud case. Agent Carver and her colleague left just before 5 a.m, with the understanding that Gerald would be making himself available the following day for a more formal interview. There was no arrest that night. The investigation was already underway, and Gerald's voluntary disclosure, however compelled it had been by circumstance, was noted. It wouldn't save him, but it wouldn't hurt him either. When they left, Gerald stood in the middle of the living room looking at his wife and his daughter, and he looked diminished in a way that was painful to watch because even then, even in that moment, you could see him trying to recalibrate, trying to find the version of the story where he came out with some portion of dignity intact. Some habits are very hard to break. Patricia told him quietly to go to the hotel. She said it without drama, without a raised voice, without the accumulated anger of however many years of watching him perform himself for the world at the expense of the people closest to him. She said it like a woman who had made up her mind, and he went. Melissa sat on the couch for a long time without speaking. Daniel was beside her, his hand over hers, and I was in the armchair across from them, and we all just existed in the aftermath of it for a while, the way you do when something large has happened and you don't yet have the words for it. Finally, Melissa looked up at me. I'm sorry, Frank, she said, for the table, for all of it. The things I let happen because I thought if I could keep everyone happy, it would all... You don't need to apologize to me, I said. You drove all the way back here at midnight in the snow. You called me, I said simply. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, Why? Why did you come back? After the way tonight started, after the things he said to you. I thought about it. Because you called, I said again, and because you're family, and because that's what that word means, when you strip everything else away from it. Daniel was looking at his hands. After a moment he said, I said he was more important now. You said it? I said. It wasn't true. But you said it. He looked up at me. I'm not angry at you, I said. I need you to know that. I left tonight because I needed to leave, not because I was angry. I left because I knew I couldn't stay and be quiet, and I didn't want to make your Christmas into a confrontation. But I wasn't angry. I paused. I was sad. There's a difference. Daniel got up from the sofa and crossed the room and sat on the arm of my chair, the way he used to do when he was 7 or 8, when he wanted to be near me but didn't quite know how to ask for it. And he put his arm around my shoulders, and I put mine around his. And we stayed like that, while the Christmas lights blinked in the corner, and the snow piled up outside, and the night slowly started to turn toward dawn. It took months. These things always take months. Gerald's case moved through the federal system with the slow, methodical pace of government legal procedure. There were hearings, depositions, evidence gathering. Daniel retained a lawyer of his own, not because he was implicated in anything, but because, as Gerald's son-in-law, there were questions about properties and shared family assets that needed professional clarity. The lawyer, a woman named Susan Park, who came from a firm in Columbus, was excellent, precise, calm, and thorough in a way that reminded me of the best drivers I'd worked with. People who understood that thoroughness was a form of protection. I sat in the gallery at the formal hearing in March in a federal courthouse in Cincinnati on a gray Tuesday when the last of the winter was making its final stubborn argument. Gerald sat at a table with his attorneys. He looked, from across the room, older than he had at Christmas. Not broken, but genuinely weathered in a way that was different from his usual careful self-presentation. The silver hair was the same, but something behind the eyes had changed. Some of the performance was gone. The charges were substantive: wire fraud, securities fraud, misrepresentation to investors. The federal prosecutor was a methodical, unhurried woman who laid out the pattern of Gerald's behavior with the kind of calm authority that I recognized and respected. She didn't editorialize. She didn't reach for dramatic flourishes. She just presented the facts in sequence and let them make their own argument, and they made it very well. Melissa testified. That was the hardest part to watch. She sat in that witness chair in a gray jacket, and she answered every question honestly and completely, and her voice only broke once, when she was asked whether her father had ever given her reason to suspect the irregularities in his business. And she said, "No, I trusted him completely." She said it without self-pity and without accusation. She said it like a woman reporting a fact about herself that she had finally made peace with. I was asked to provide a brief statement about the events of Christmas night. The disclosure in the living room, the sequence of events, the content of what Gerald had said. I gave my statement in the same way I'd have given a security incident report. Factual, chronological, no embellishment. The prosecutor thanked me. Gerald's attorney didn't cross-examine me. Gerald, from his table, watched me the whole time I was speaking, and when I was finished and I stepped down and walked back to the gallery, I passed close enough to him that I could have reached out and touched the sleeve of his jacket. I didn't look at him, but I heard him exhale. Outside the courthouse in the gray March air, Melissa put her arm through mine and we walked to the parking lot together. Daniel was a few steps ahead on his phone. Patricia had not come. She was managing her own situation, her own attorney, her own slow process of reorganizing a life that had been built around a version of Gerald that turned out not to be fully real. She was doing it with dignity, from what Melissa said. She was living with her sister in Cincinnati for a while, taking a watercolor class on Wednesday afternoons, learning what she liked when she didn't have to arrange herself around someone else's preferences. "Are you okay?" I asked Melissa as we walked. She thought about it honestly. "I'm getting there," she said. "Some days are easier than others, but I'm getting there." I squeezed her arm. "That's all it is," I said. "Getting there, one day at a time." Gerald received a formal sentence in June. 47 months, minimum security, along with substantial financial restitution and the loss of his real estate licensing. He would be in his late 60s when he came out. It wasn't what either of his attorneys had hoped for, and it was lighter than what some of his investors had demanded. The prosecutor described it as appropriate given his cooperation and his lack of prior criminal record. It felt to me like about right, not justice in the grand, satisfying sense that word sometimes carries. Just an accounting. A consequence that matched an action. Melissa and Daniel drove home together that afternoon. I followed in my truck. We had dinner at their place that evening. Something simple. Soup from a pot Melissa had started that morning. Bread from the bakery 2 blocks from their house. The easy, unglamorous warmth of a kitchen that has figured out what it needs to be. We talked about ordinary things. The house they were still hoping to find. The garden Daniel had apparently decided to attempt in their current backyard. A documentary they'd been watching. Normal life, continuing. At one point, over the soup, Daniel said, "I keep thinking about what you said. At Christmas, that you were sad, not angry." "I remember," I said. "I've been thinking about the difference." He was quiet for a moment. "I think I said some things that were... I was trying to make everyone fit together. Gerald and you. And I thought the way to do that was to make a hierarchy, I guess. To put someone at the top. And I picked the wrong person." "You picked the person who asked you to," I said. He looked at me. "That's not a criticism," I said. "It's just an observation. You didn't invent the hierarchy, Danny. You inherited it. Gerald made that hierarchy everywhere he went. You just tried to accommodate it because you thought that was what love required. And it wasn't. Love doesn't require you to make anyone smaller to make someone else comfortable," I said. "Not even your father-in-law. Not even me, if it ever came to that." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Dad." "I know," I said. And I meant it in the deepest sense, not just acknowledging the apology, but accepting it, filing it away, releasing it, letting it be over. The summer that followed was gentle in the way that summers can be after hard winters. I drove down to Columbus more often, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just for a Saturday afternoon working in the backyard with Daniel, building raised garden beds out of cedar planks, fighting the Ohio clay together with a pair of spades and a willingness to sweat. Melissa joined us sometimes, in old jeans with dirt on the knees, completely unlike the composed young woman who had held a table setting together at Christmas and tried very hard to keep every piece of her life in its designated place. I liked her more in those garden afternoons than I had at any formal dinner. I liked the version of her that didn't have to perform. In August, an old colleague of mine from Premier Security Group, a man named Lou Aguilar who'd worked close protection with me for almost 20 years, came through Millhaven on his way to visit his brother in Youngstown and stopped for coffee. We sat on the back porch with the late summer still thick and warm around us, and he told me I seemed different. "Different how?" I asked. "Lighter," he said. "You seem lighter, Frank. When Carol passed, you got this, not heavy exactly, but compressed, like everything got pressed down small, and now it's like you've decompressed a little." I thought about that. "Maybe," I said. "Something happened," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "Something happened." I smiled. The kind of something that breaks things open before it lets them heal. Lou understood that. He'd had those in his own life. He raised his coffee cup in a small toast, and I raised mine, and we sat for a while watching the light go long and golden across the yard. In September, exactly 1 year after Daniel and Melissa's wedding, their daughter was born. They named her Caroline. I was at the hospital, in the waiting room, for 9 hours. And when Daniel came through the door with the look that all new parents have, that particular demolished, radiant, barely holding it together look, I stood up and he walked straight into my arms and held on like he was 9 years old again. I held Caroline for the first time that evening in a rocking chair beside Melissa's hospital bed. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, a full head of dark hair, eyes that were still figuring out what they were going to be. She looked at me with the unfocused, profound attention of someone who has just arrived and is very serious about assessing where she's landed. "Hello," I said very quietly. "I'm your grandfather. I know that doesn't mean much to you yet, but it means everything to me." She closed her eyes and went to sleep against my chest, and I sat there in that rocking chair with the lights low and my son and his wife quiet behind me, and I thought about Carol, who should have been there, who would have been there, who would have taken that baby from my arms within about 30 seconds flat and not given her back for hours. I thought about how loss doesn't go away, it just makes room, and how the room it makes is sometimes, eventually, filled with something new. November arrived with the first cold, and one afternoon a letter appeared in Daniel and Melissa's mailbox with a return address from a minimum security facility in southern Ohio. Melissa brought it to a Sunday dinner at my house. She hadn't opened it yet. She and Daniel sat across the kitchen table from me, the envelope between us. "I didn't know if I wanted to read it," she said, "and I didn't know if I wanted to read it alone." "You don't have to read it at all," I said. "It's yours. Entirely your decision." She looked at it for a long moment. Then she opened it. Gerald's handwriting was still precise, still controlled. Even from a correctional facility, the man had excellent penmanship. Melissa read it silently first, and then she read it aloud, because Daniel and I were both watching her face, and she could tell. It was 4 pages. It was honest in a way I hadn't expected from him. Not the performed honesty of a man who wants something in return, but something quieter and more costly. He wrote about his father, who had been a failure in business and had drilled into Gerald from childhood that the only protection against failure was the projection of success, no matter what the reality was. He wrote about Patricia and the ways he had made her invisible for years without knowing the name for what he was doing. He wrote about Melissa and how much it had cost him to read her testimony in the courtroom and understand, for the first time, what the word trust had actually meant to her when she applied it to him. He wrote about Christmas night. He said that when I sat across from him in the living room and said what I had said, he had understood for the first time in a very long time that he was in the presence of someone who saw through the performance to the actual man underneath, and that the actual man had been terrifying to be seen as. He wrote, "I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not asking for it. I'm asking that you know I am trying, for perhaps the first time in my life, to understand what I owe and to pay it honestly." Melissa folded the letter when she finished reading. She sat for a while looking at the middle distance. "I don't know what to do with that," she said finally. "You don't have to do anything with it right now," I said. "Does it mean I forgive him?" "No," I said. "Forgiveness isn't something you decide in a moment after one letter. It's something that either comes or doesn't over a long time, and it's yours, not his." "What do you feel?" she asked me. "When you think about him now?" I thought about that honestly, the way she deserved. "I feel something like pity," I said, "and something like clarity. He spent 60 years performing a man he thought he needed to be, and in the end the performance cost him everything real. That's not something I envy." I paused. "I don't hate him, Melissa. I hate what his choices did to the people in that room at Christmas. But the man, the actual man in those 4 pages, I don't hate him. I just don't want him at the head of any table in my family's life again." She looked at me for a long moment, and then she nodded once, slowly, the nod of someone who has found the words they were looking for in someone else's mouth. Daniel put his arm around her shoulders, and the kitchen was warm, and the November dark was outside, and Caroline was asleep in the next room in her carrier, making the small, unconcerned sounds of a person who has no idea that any of this ever happened, who will grow up in a house without the weight of any of it, and who will only know, from whatever she's told and whatever she absorbs from the people around her, that love is something steady, and that family is something that holds, even when it has to break open first. That, I think, is the best outcome any of us can hope for. Now it is December again. Not Christmas yet, a few weeks out still, but the season is here, the cold is here, the particular quality of December light that makes everything feel both temporary and significant. I drove down to Columbus last weekend and had dinner with Daniel and Melissa and Caroline. Caroline is 3 months old and has, in the last 2 weeks, discovered that faces are interesting and that smiling at them produces wonderful results. She spent most of the dinner smiling at me from across the table with a focus that I found completely disabling. We sat at the dining room table, the same table with the same leaf I helped Daniel put in last November. And I sat at the head of it, because Melissa and Daniel had put me there, not with ceremony, not with any comment about it, just because they had put me there. And it was not about the chair. I want to say that clearly. It was never about the chair. It was about whether you are seen and by whom, and whether the people who are supposed to see you clearly actually do. I see my son. I see who he is, a good engineer and a good husband and a new father who held his daughter for the first time with the same look on his face that I had when I first held him. I see Melissa, who is not her father's choices and never was, who called me at midnight in the snow because she needed someone she trusted, and who has been, in the month since, learning what it means to trust someone who will not manipulate the trust when she gives it. And my granddaughter, who looked at me last Sunday from across the dinner table and smiled the utterly uninstructed smile of a person who has not yet learned to perform anything, she sees me too, in her own new way, with those dark eyes that have finally decided what color they are going to be. Her grandmother's eyes, actually. I noticed it last week, and I had to look away for a moment, out the window, at the December street, and collect myself. Carol would have loved this, is what I thought. Carol would have absolutely loved this. Here is what I know. After 63 years, after 31 years on the road sitting in parking lots and reading rooms, after losing the person who was the center of my world and slowly learning to build a new center, after one Christmas that broke things open and 1 year of watching those things become something new. Strength isn't loudness. Strength isn't dominating the room or holding the head of the table or making other people feel small so that you feel large. I've sat across from that kind of power for 31 years, and it always turns out to be the most expensive performance a person can give because it costs everything. And when it runs out, there's nothing real underneath it. Real strength is answering the phone when someone you love is afraid. It's driving back through the snow at midnight because someone called your name. It's sitting in a room where you were told you didn't matter, and staying calm and staying present and knowing, privately, without needing to announce it, that you matter enormously, and that the people worth staying for will figure that out in their own time. Real strength is the ability to be seen, to sit across from someone who is performing at you and simply look at them with clear eyes and refuse to be impressed by the performance, and refuse to perform one back at them. There is nothing more unsettling to a man who lives behind a mask than someone who looks at the mask without blinking and does not pretend it's a face. I've been asked, since all of this became known among the people who know us, and small towns and social circles have a way of making these things known, whether I was angry at Daniel for what he said, whether I felt betrayed, whether the Christmas night where I was told another man was more important now felt like something I would carry as a wound. And I tell them, honestly, no. I felt sad. I felt the particular sadness of watching someone you love be temporarily inside a story that isn't true about them. But I never doubted my son. I never doubted what we were to each other, underneath all of it. Some things are not fragile, and the love between a father and a child, when it's been built honestly over a lifetime, is not one of the fragile things. It can withstand a Christmas night. It can withstand a year of someone else's influence. It can withstand being placed at the far end of a table. It comes back. It always comes back, because it never really went anywhere to begin with. What Gerald Hargrove never understood, what men like him rarely understand because the performance leaves no room for the understanding, is that the people sitting at the table are not defined by where they're sitting. They're defined by who they are when the night ends. And when the Christmas night ended, I was the person who drove back through the snow. I was the person Melissa called. I was the person who sat in that living room and said, clearly and without anger, the thing that needed to be said. And then I was the person who held my son in the kitchen while his soup got cold and listened to him find his way back to himself. That's who I am. That's who I've always been. And if you've ever been pushed to the edge of a table that you helped build, I want you to know, the table doesn't define you. The people who built it with you, the ones who find their way back to who they are, the ones who call you at midnight when they're afraid, those people define you. Hold on to them. They're worth coming back through the snow for. If this story touched something in you today, I'd be grateful if you left a like on this video. It helps more people find stories like this one, and these are stories worth finding. Leave me a comment and tell me, have you ever been at the wrong end of a table? Have you ever had to drive back through the snow for someone? I read every single comment, and I mean that. And if you want to hear more stories from this life of mine, and there are more, I promise you, please subscribe to this channel. It takes 2 seconds, and it means more than you might think. One last thing. One sentence, and then I'll let you go. The people who love you will call you at midnight in the snow, and the only thing you need to decide is whether you're the kind of person who answers.